Good evening, everyone. This is John W. Vandercook speaking for Alka Seltzer, bringing you the news of the world. On our tour of the news capitals this evening, we expect to hear direct from Moscow or London, from Guam, from Washington, and my own commentary from the NBC newsroom in New York. But first, here is a brief message from Charles Lyon.
With another summer weekend on the way, here's something you might want to think about. No doubt you're planning to do something a little special, all the more so if the weather should turn out to be hot and fair. So just in case you may want the relief it can give from a headache or an acid-upset stomach, check up on that supply of Alka Seltzer. Irregular weekend hours, too much cold food and drink, these can cause distress and interfere with your plans. So make sure you have plenty of Alka Seltzer handy so you'll be all set for the prompt relief it can give. You can get Alka Seltzer at any drugstore. Now, John W. Vandercook and the news of the world.
The Jap offer to surrender everything but Hirohito, apparently sprung prematurely this morning by the Jap radio, has now worked its way through regular diplomatic channels to the four allied governments. Japan has transmitted the offer via both Sweden and Switzerland. Whatever may be the attitude in London and Washington, few believe either China or Russia will swallow the Jap emperor, symbol of the whole Japanese pretense of racial superiority and of all that's aggressive and anti-democratic, without a great deal of gagging. The U.S. has taken the news calmly. Not so London, where public celebration has been even more marked than on VE Day. The U.S. submarine fleet files a routine report of the sinking of 50 more Japanese ships. What sentiment does exist for accepting the Japanese terms as offered, and having done with it, is based on two things. One is the perfectly natural desire of a world sick of killing to end the slaughter at almost any price. That impulse has to be examined as it is now being examined by the four allied governments, in the light of whether hasty acceptance would be penny wise but pound foolish. Grim though it is, we all of us know if we pause and reflect, it would be far better, since we are so close to total victory, to spend, if need be, a few more lives now than to be content with a patchwork settlement, which would mean we should have it all to do over again a generation hence. The other reason one hears advanced for accepting a continuation of the imperial regime in Japan is founded on the belief the Japanese have never known any other form of government, that they are completely devoted to the reigning house, and that all Japs solemnly believe in the emperor's divinity. To a more or less extent, all those ideas are incorrect. The present Jap government and system of emperor worship are almost as synthetic and new as a plastic toothbrush handle. Both have been put over on the Japanese people and the outside world with the same deliberate calculation which goes into selling the stock issue of a fake gold mine. It is legend, not fact, that Hirohito, whom we are now asked to support as a permanent feature of the bomb-eroded Jap landscape, is the direct descendant of the sun goddess, or indeed of anyone else. Hirohito's ancestry is as mixed as yours or mine. Concubines, commoners, and several brand-new families have left their imprint on the imperial genealogy. The Japs accepted an emperor as the nominal chief of their nation as recently as 1868. For the by no means trifling period of 265 years prior to that date, most Japanese had scarcely known there was such a thing as a royal dynasty. They had certainly not worshipped it. Japan had been run by many quarreling families of powerful nobles. The emperor, in the person of Hirohito's grandfather, was placed upon the throne purely as a political convenience. The ever-changing, though real rulers of Japan, the noble families, the professional militarists, and the new rich industrialists, though they have practiced the outward show of obedience and devotion, have never forgotten for a moment the Japanese emperor is to them no more than a front man, a gilded puppet to be manipulated by whoever is behind him. I do not think the blood-guilty real rulers of Japan forgot that when they made the peace proposal this morning. The much-advertised religion of emperor worship, which we are now being called upon to respect, is even more a synthetic product than the emperor himself. Shintoism, the way of the gods at base, is a muddled, primitive, extremely ancient belief in an almost limitless number of nature gods and nature goddesses. It is plainly recognized in Japan that state Shinto, which demands a belief in the emperor's divinity, is something else again. It was introduced 77 years ago as a calculated means of compelling the devotion of Jap civilians to their government. A special government bureau has the duty of propagating that new and cynically created faith. Many believe the doctrine has never really deeply penetrated the Jap consciousness. One knows positively a great many modern-mind Japanese regarded the whole thing as absurd. Yet we are being told that emperor government and emperor religion, neither of which is as old as many men now living, are absolutely essential if Japan is not to pine away with grief. One could wish the famous U.S. officer of the Battle of the Bulge were somewhere around right now to remark again, nuts. And now to NBC in Moscow. That was somewhat unexpected. We hoped for a direct broadcast from NBC's own reporter, Robert Magadoff, in Moscow. Instead, we're able to bring you at this same moment NBC in London.
This is Ed Hawker in London. If it wasn't clear before, number 10 Downing Street made it perfectly clear just 3/4 of an hour ago. The British government is in communication with the governments of the United States, Russia, and China about Japan's surrender terms, but no official statement can be made now. That, in effect, is the wording of a statement issued from the Prime Minister's residence. And then, as a possible indication of things to come, some practical guidance is included for the British people. They will, says the statement, get 2 days off with pay immediately following the big news we're all waiting to hear. As for London tonight, it's most un-English. Since the advent of the Yanks, we've really learned to let ourselves go. That, in effect, is the comment I've been hearing on the streets of London tonight. Most un-English, and judging from the reports from home, the British are getting in more celebrating than their cousin the Yanks in America, premature though it may be. The people of London, augmented by a sizable American population, have been going hog wild ever since the news broke shortly after midday London time. They're completely ignoring the fact that there's a big if involved, and what's more, as one young GI put it, they don't care. No matter how you look at it, Mystery said, you and I aren't going to the Pacific. This is Ed Hawker in London, returning you to NBC in New York.
And now to NBC in the Philippines.
This is Merrill Miller reporting from Manila. General MacArthur's headquarters city went back to the routine of war this morning after a weird night of rumors and celebration prompted by the Tokyo radio surrender appeal. The regular morning communique reports that Far East Air Force bombers have sunk or damaged another 90 Japanese ships, including one small aircraft carrier. However, there isn't a soldier here who hasn't got one ear cocked to the latest radio bulletins, and every man is hoping deep in his heart that this is it, that the war is over. Newspapers, which burst forth with glaring and in some cases very inaccurate extras last night, have sober editions on the streets now, and most people realize that the surrender excitement of last night had a catch to it. This was a noisy city for most of the night. Try as the military police might, with the use of reinforced patrols and prowling radio cars broadcasting the latest facts, the impromptu celebration could not be put down completely. Little groups here and there would burst forth with cheering and fireworks, as one group was silenced somewhere else. Average GI opinion is that it's too good to be true, and it will save the thousands of lives that an invasion would cost. Most of these fighting people out here think this is a lull period, while the Big Four make a decision as to whether or not to accept the Japanese offer to surrender. Just the fact that the news of the surrender appeal has become official is a great stimulant for the Army out here. Put celebrations aside for the moment, troops are training, supplies and reinforcements are rolling in. The Air Force goes on practicing, and the Navy is ready, for a good many of these combat veterans are willing to bet you that they will soon be in Tokyo. If willpower can do it alone, the fighting veterans of the Pacific Theater have made up their minds the war is over. Disillusionment will be bitter if something collapses to end this period of joy, and the GIs will react on Japan with double fury. This is Merrill Miller switching you back to NBC in Washington.
The State Department has just announced that the official surrender offer has been received from the Japanese through the Swiss, and a certified copy has been put on Secretary Burns' desk. It was put there 35 minutes ago. The official copy is almost exactly the same as the broadcast from Tokyo early this morning, the broadcast you have heard about for a long time. We may now take it for granted that the Allied powers are in consultation because the Japanese have raised an entirely new issue, purposely, of course, namely the question of survival for their emperor. The United States takes the point of view that it's okay with us, provided the Japanese people want their stuffed shirt king. But up to now, we have refused to agree to his survival before we learn what the Japanese people want through occupation. Presumably, the British string along with this idea. The Chinese are undecided, and our latest ally in the Pacific, Russia, has said not one word about the emperor one way or the other. The whole business would be so much eyewash, except for one important fact. It is probable that the Japanese armies, all of them, scattered from one end of Eastern Asia to the other, would surrender more willingly. That sporadic fighting would be avoided if the emperor gave them the word. In any event, you can place a pretty big bet that the Allied powers are framing a reply to the Japanese government something like this. The emperor and the military clique that started the war in the Pacific must both sign on the dotted line, sign the terms of Potsdam, which are, that way they will give up their arms, all of them, at a prearranged time, at a prearranged series of points. That we're not too much concerned about the emperor remaining on the throne, only he will remain so only under the strictest control of Allied forces of occupation. And finally, that all 135,000 of the American and European prisoners now in the hands of the Japanese must be delivered up safe and unharmed, that is, unharmed more than they are now. It'll probably take several days to work out the deal if and after it has been made. And you can bet your last dollar, too, that the Allied governments won't announce the end of the war until they have guarantees that the Japanese will carry out the terms we lay down. The American people are being very patient about it all, and the government is grateful. Here in Washington, crowds gathered in Lafayette Park across the street from the White House this afternoon. Good-natured, patient crowds. People sat on newspapers in the grass and chatted. Tonight, the papers are still there, along with a couple of elderly gentlemen who fell asleep, waiting for the news that did not come. Everybody else went to dinner. Comment ranged pretty widely here. One fellow who came back from the Pacific without any legs said we should not budge an inch. Senator Chavez of New Mexico, however, who has a son fighting on the Pacific front, has a different idea. I do hope, he said, that we will work out some kind of a surrender so we can have peace. And that's what happened in Washington today.
Good nutrition is the foundation of good health. That's something to keep in mind, friends, and something you should be sure about. Now, since vitamins are vital to good nutrition, and since vitamins are so often lacking in food, make sure of a basic daily supply by taking a single one-a-day brand multiple vitamin capsule every day. Start every day with one a day. You need vitamins in your daily diet. Vitamins, among other things, help you keep up your normal resistance to such simple infections as colds. Vitamins help you keep on feeling generally well. So bolster up your daily diet by taking a single one-a-day brand multiple vitamin capsule every day. A 60-capsule package costs only $2, and it lasts you for 60 days, which means only $1 a month. Just listen to this offer. Go to your druggist and get that $2 package of one-a-day brand multiple vitamin capsules. Take one capsule every day for 60 days. Then at the end of that time, if you're not pleased with one-a-day vitamins, return the package to your druggist and he will gladly refund your money. Make sure you get the genuine one-a-day brand multiple vitamin capsules. For like all other Miles products, they are guaranteed to please you or your money will be refunded. Start every day with one-a-day. Now back to John W. Vandercook.
Moscow. Meanwhile, Russian tank columns have smashed through the Jap lines in Manchuria for multiple gains up to 106 miles. Due west across Manchukuo, other Russian divisions are pouring like a release flood through a broken dam into Jap-held territory. As in Europe, the Red Banner Army is employing vast quantities of artillery and great numbers of heavy tanks. And that's the news of the world. This is John W. Vandercook speaking for Alka Seltzer. I shall be back on the air again for 15 minutes at 5:30 p.m. Eastern Wartime tomorrow, and as usual at this same hour on Monday. So, until tomorrow, goodbye from the NBC newsroom in New York.
Friends, the Alka Seltzer National Barn Dance tomorrow night will feature Songs of the West as the boys and girls of the old hayloft get together for a Dude Ranch party. The National Barn Dance is broadcast over most of these same stations every Saturday night, 9 o'clock Eastern Wartime, 8 o'clock Central Wartime. This is Charles Lyon. This is the National Broadcasting Company.
WEAF, New York. Again, the National Broadcasting Company interrupts all its programs to bring you a special broadcast. At this time on this important news of the day, we present the distinguished NBC commentators H.B. Colton-Bourne and Caesar Searchinger. First, Mr. Coltonborn.
Good morning, everybody. We are here in the NBC newsroom with the bulletins coming in constantly on Japan's surrender offer. And with every minute that passes, it seems more certain that the offer is definite and that there is a 9 out of 10 chance that it will be accepted. At this moment, the British cabinet is meeting. The United States leaders of our war effort are meeting in Washington. And we now know definitely that last night the Japanese foreign minister gave to the Russian ambassador in Tokyo a definite statement that Japan desired to surrender. The one thing that Japan desired to make clear is that they reserved the position of the emperor. Now, the position of the emperor was not mentioned in the Potsdam Declaration because we were perfectly willing to accept a continuance of the emperor's rule. If we had not been willing to do that, we would have mentioned him specifically, since we know that he is an outstanding factor. As a matter of fact, the information that came to me some days ago is that when Russia first transmitted Japan's peace offer, there were 2 conditions. 1, that the position of the emperor should not be touched. 2, that there should be no occupation of Japan. Japan was then advised that while we might consider retaining the emperor, we could not consider under any circumstances the failure to occupy her territory. And as you know, the Potsdam Declaration specifically says that we have the choice to occupy such points in Japan as we please, and there is no limit as to the time during which they are to be occupied. Now, obviously, anyone who reads the Potsdam Declaration, the Potsdam Ultimatum, must realize that we will be in complete control of the situation once we are in Japan, and that we can very easily manipulate matters so that the emperor will assume that particular position in the new setup which we desire him to assume. And we could also, obviously, in educating the Japanese people to democratic government, as we say we will do, we could educate them up to the point where they would reject the emperor. In other words, there is no importance to be attached to what we do with the emperor at this particular moment. And my own feeling is, on the basis of what I know about his position and of what I learned in Japan, is that, as Senator Thomas has said this morning, he can be tremendously useful to us. For example, there are troops scattered all over the Pacific, Japanese troops, which would be capable of carrying on the war perhaps for 6 months, perhaps for a year. Now, the one voice that could definitely recall those troops, that could persuade all of them, and probably all of the commanders, to accept the peace, is the voice of the emperor. And surely we would be more than foolish if we did not use his position, his power, and his prestige to accomplish the purposes of the Potsdam Ultimatum. And that ultimatum is accepted completely, with the single exception of the position of the emperor. Now, Britain right along has been perfectly willing to retain the emperor. A large section of our State Department has been perfectly willing to keep him. And knowing the Russians as realists, we can be sure that they will be perfectly willing to go along, knowing as they do that his whole position, his entire power, is dependent upon us once we are in the islands of Japan. Now, only time can tell as to whether or not the emperor is worth something to the democratic cause, or whether he represents too much the ancient tradition and must be removed. And we can depend upon securing the cooperation of the Japanese people for accomplishing the purpose which we believe will be soundest in carrying out the Potsdam Ultimatum. We can get their cooperation once we are there and in complete control. For all these reasons, my own conviction is that what we have here is an offer of surrender that will be accepted by the Allies. Now, there may be some further negotiation. There may be a desire, both on the part of Japan and on the part of the Allies, to get 1 or 2 things more definitely in line with regard to the emperor's position. Also, remember that official communications are now coming presumably through Sweden, because Moscow tells us this morning that the foreign minister's offer of surrender is being transmitted to Allied capitals through Sweden. So undoubtedly, these communications are coming in. They are developing very rapidly, and everything that we have had so far indicates that this is it. Japanese surrender is undoubtedly a matter of hours. And here's NBC's Caesar Searchinger with more comment.
Good morning. Well, this is one of the exciting mornings in NBC, as you can imagine. We are waiting momentarily for the final news that Japan has surrendered. In other words, accepted our terms of surrender as published in the ultimatum of June 26th at Potsdam. Now, what does that mean? Among other things, that means that the terms of the Cairo Declaration shall be carried out, and Japanese sovereignty shall be limited to the islands of Honshu, Hokkaido, Kyushu, Shikoku, and such minor islands as we determine. In other words, Japan will lose Formosa. She will lose Sakhalin. She will lose all of the Pacific Islands, which we have occupied or are about to occupy, and she will lose Manchuria and everything she has occupied in China. And that is a very interesting point, because at the very last hour, you might say at the 11th hour and 55th minute and 59th second, Russia entered the war. Russia declared war on Japan according to agreement, as President Truman said, but the time had not been set. But when that first bomb dropped on Hiroshima on Sunday night, something happened in Moscow. Within 72 hours, Russia was at war with Japan. The historical inference in the future will be, of course, that the atomic bomb precipitated Russia into the war at the last minute. Now, it's important to note that Russia immediately associated herself with the declaration of July 26. In other words, the surrender terms of the Allies to Japan. It means that Japan must surrender to Russia as well as to ourselves. It is also important to notice that TV Sung and the Chinese foreign minister returned to Moscow and are now negotiating at the Kremlin. What is the significance of that? The Cairo Declaration, which was made by FDR and Churchill and Chiang Kai-shek, said that Japan will be stripped of all those territories that I mentioned. In fact, all the territories she acquired over the last 50 years. Now, can Russia just submit to that? I mean, can she just simply have Manchuria returned to China, as is agreed there, and Korea given her independence? Look at the record of Russia in Manchuria and in Korea. It goes back, so far as Manchuria is concerned, to the 17th century. Manchuria is a rich country, the size of Texas and Colorado combined, and perhaps as rich and richer than those states. Now, Russia's record there is that back in 1861, she took a part of Manchuria, namely the part along the Sea of Japan, the Yellow Sea rather, now known as the Soviet Maritime Province, whose main port is Vladivostok. She spent many years and many millions of rubles building her Trans-Siberian Railroad out to Manchuria and to Vladivostok. She intervened in Japan's war against China in 1895 and secured the Liaotung Peninsula, that appendage in the south of Manchuria, including the warm water ports of Port Arthur and Dairen. And after she got the southern ports, she proceeded to develop the rest of Manchuria, which was still nominally Chinese. She built railroads connecting the ports with her Trans-Siberian line and lines into China. Millions of Chinese settlers poured in. Russia had reason and has reason to consider herself the great pioneer and builder-upper of Manchuria. Besides, she was also exploiting Korea in an uneasy partnership with Japan. And all that was swept away in her war with Japan in 1904-5, which was one of the most humiliating wars a great power has suffered. A great power has suffered in recent times. Now, Russia is obviously returning to the Pacific, not merely out of friendship for us, because great powers don't go to war for such reasons, but to get even. In other words, to go back and claim her great interests in the Pacific and to have a settlement with Japan on her own account. Now, see what happened there. In 1918, when the Soviet Russia was still in the throes of revolution, the Japanese came back and invaded not only Manchuria, but Siberia. And ever since then, ever since the Russians have been driven out of Manchuria virtually by the Japanese, that is in 1931, those two nations have been facing each other across that border, that long 2,000-mile border of Manchuria and along the borders of Mongolia with their great armies. The Kwantung Army of the Japanese on one side and the great Red Banner Army of the Russians on the other side. And those borders have been fortified. There have been hundreds and hundreds of border clashes during that time up to the recent accord between Japan and Russia, and there have been two full-scale wars involving hundreds of thousands of men and tens of thousands of casualties. Now, all of that has gone by Russia. Russia has put into Manchuria, and she has put a great deal of investment into Korea, and she's put a great deal of effort in other parts of the northern China. Is she just simply going to give that up now and return everything to China without any strings attached? Well, it isn't in the way of powers, whatever they are, imperialistic or communistic, to just do that. So I feel that the surrender of Japan, while it will technically end the war, is not likely to stop the Soviet armies now on the march in Manchuria. They will go on and occupy all the country, which will become the subject of negotiations at the peace table. Manchuria is not the only score, of course, they have to settle. The whole question of China gets a new slant by her entry into the war. There is the question of Outer and Inner Mongolia. There's the question of the warm water ports, Port Arthur and so on. There's the question of Xinjiang, or Chinese Turkestan, which was occupied by Russia and that was then released and practically given back to China. But China is separated from it by the Gobi Desert, and it is not likely that Russia will give that huge country up. It's the size of France by itself. Then there's that great question of the Chinese communists. The Russian interest in them goes back to 1922. It's true, they have dealt with Chiang Kai-shek since then. But since 1927, Chiang has tried to exterminate those communists, or northern Chinese, as they like to be called. Russia sent supplies to the Chongqing government, but it stopped on the pretext of the war with Germany, and in reality because Russia couldn't control the armaments after they got to Chongqing government and couldn't control them whether they weren't being used against the communists. Now, today, those communists occupy the huge border region near Siberia. 50 or more million people are there. Can Russia abandon them in a deal with Chiang? More likely, she will demand a friendly government there, as she has demanded friendly governments on her borders in Europe. In other words, the war with Japan may be over, but the great questions to be settled in Asia loom up more and greater than ever before.
During the past quarter hour, the National Broadcasting Company has presented H.V. Coltonborn and Caesar Searchinger. Keep tuned to your NBC station for the later news.